Hello, everybody. This is Ian Williams, President of the Foreign Press Association in New York. And today we're returning to one of our perennial subjects, which is the situation across the Straits of Taiwan. And just as we call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of Mexico, we're calling Taiwan Taiwan, regardless of other people who might have other names for it. I'm striking a blow for linguistic independence. And today we're very fortunate to have Kerry Brown, whose book was rather favorably reviewed in the Financial Times, which has lately become almost a sort of Bolshevik paragon and its reporting of events. And Kerry is a former diplomat who was actually in China. I think you were the first secretary, weren't you? Managed to spend his time in China without being held hostage or having his cat killed by Red Guards. So he's possibly more favorably inclined than previous British diplomats might have been. And also, intriguingly, was also spent some time in Inner Mongolia, which I'd like to hear your thoughts on that later on. Just how autonomous are the autonomous regions, because it's a precursor to some extent of the fate of Taiwan under if it agreed to be incorporated. Autonomy is a wonderful name, but it's what I saw in China. It's not much exercised, as many people in Hong Kong might be prepared to testify now. So your book, Why Taiwan Matters, freshly out, and it is from St. Martin's Press. And basically, as far as I can see, it's an invocation to do nothing. Not quite, but it's that was the invocation once given to a friend of mine by his superior in the UN. If you want to get ahead in this organization, do nothing. And it seems to be almost the case with Taiwan, but now and again, people like the president of China seem to insist that something must be done and the situation must be crystallized, whereas many of us feel that it's probably better staying in limbo. This is Schrodinger's cat that's best kept in the box. Do not open the box, because it'll be like Pandora's. There's no telling what might come out of it. So, Kerry, that's a very brief and cartoonized version of your book. Perhaps you can disagree or expand on it and tell us what you're saying and why you think the solution to solving the Taiwan problem is not really to attempt very hard to solve the Taiwan problem.
Great. Well, thanks, Ian, and thanks for inviting me here today. So I'm speaking from Britain. So I suppose I wrote the book because there's a lot of really good stuff on Taiwan, quite detailed and specialist, but it's not really a subject that's that widely known. And so I thought it would be good to have something accessible, which did two things. One was give something about the history of the island, and then to kind of really spell out, as the book's title suggests, well, why would we want to know about this place in the rest of the world? I mean, in terms of the history, I mean, the reason why that matters is because, you know, two places claim that they have control over this island. One is the government in Taiwan itself, which is technically the Republic of China, and that's existed since 1911. Before going there in 1949 after the Chinese Civil War. And then there's the People's Republic of China, which is something that's existed since 1949, and that claims Taiwan is part of it. And so, you know, this is the heart of the whole issue, that there are basically two entities claiming one place. They are not at all similar, however. The Republic of China is 23 million people. It's, you know, a significant economy, but probably 15th or 16th in the world at the moment. Whereas the People's Republic of China is 1.4 billion people, world's second largest economy, and enormously important as a military and geopolitical player now. So this is not a competition amongst equals. Well, then why should we still be worrying about the issue? I mean, the kind of strong usually prevail in this world. Well, I suppose the problem is that one of the parties, the People's Republic, is still a Communist Party-led one-party state. There's very few of those left. And the other is a democracy and has been since the 1990s, but certainly since the presidential elections in 1996, which were multi-party and free and fair. And Taiwan has been really one of the world's great successes as a place that once used to have a sort of one-party system, but now is enjoying a pretty vibrant democracy. So this is not just a kind of territorial issue; it's a ideological issue and a values issue. And for that reason, Taiwan is closely and has been closely allied with the United States. In fact, the United States diplomatically recognized Taiwan rather than China until 1979. Then it changed its recognition. Today, it recognizes the People's Republic.
Can we stress here for people who don't know that it recognized the government in Taiwan as the government of China, full stop. It wasn't just a case of recognizing a government in Taiwan. It's one of these subtle distinctions that can get lost sometimes if people aren't au fait with the situation.
Indeed, yeah. So, I mean, all of this was managed through a kind of thing that was devised in the 1970s by Kissinger, Nixon, a man that Zhou Enlai, and Mao Zedong. 1972, when Nixon went to China and had rapprochement with the People's Republic, enormously important visit. One of the things was, what do we do about, wanting to have more relations with People's Republic, despite the fact that we only recognize the Republic of China? So they created this thing called the One China policy. It is a complex policy. It's one of those things when you try and explain it, it kind of gets more and more difficult to sort of make sense of it. But broadly, it says that the United States acknowledges the kind of position of the People's Republic of China, that there's only one China, and that Taiwan is part of that. So the word acknowledge here is all important. You can acknowledge someone else's views, but it doesn't mean you have to completely agree with their right or correct. On that ambiguity hinges the whole thing, because still to this day, America has a one China policy. So do most countries. I mean, Britain has a version, Australia has a version, Japan, almost everyone. So most countries in the world today recognize the People's Republic of China diplomatically as the only government of China, but they still have relations with Taiwan. And they kind of leave things ambiguous because their argument is, well, there might be only one China, but in fact, today, there are two places that claim to be different entities. And it's just best that, we leave that until both of those two have a common agreement on how they might reunify, and they do it peacefully. Otherwise, just leave things as they are. So this is really the situation that we have come to. It's a very frustrating policy. It's one that the People's Republic of China, particularly under Xi Jinping, its current leader, does not like and is not happy with. However, it has meant that broadly, across this 100 kilometers of water between China and Taiwan, the Taiwan Strait, there has been peace. There's been plenty of tensions. There's been all sorts of scuffles, but on the whole, there has not been the kind of breakout until now of the sort of conflict we see between Russia and Ukraine, the kind of conflicts we see in, for instance, the Middle East. That has been avoided. In the book, I argue that that is a really good thing. Many people have drawn parallels between Russia and Ukraine and say, really, China is like Russia and Taiwan is like Ukraine. But there are many, many differences. One difference is, of course, Ukraine is not an island, whereas Taiwan is. So an attack on it is easier. An attack on an island is not easy. That's one issue. But the second is really that, in fact, Taiwan and China, it's a much, much trickier situation. It's not just that there might be a kind of, war and it would be like Russia-Ukraine, a nasty war, a completely, sort of avoidable war, but, kind of something that we just contain and live with. The problem with China and Taiwan is that it would have a way bigger impact. It would have bigger impact, firstly, because economically, this is the region, this is the world's kind of heart, really. Massive amounts of manufactured goods, semiconductors, things like this go through this area. We can say a bit about that in a minute. But also, it's kind of, really in the end, pitching China, the world's second biggest economy, one of the biggest militaries, one of the most powerful countries in the world, against the United States, still the biggest economy and still the most powerful country. That's no joke. I mean, it's not likely in other situations that you would have China and the United States clashing, um, nor is it very likely that you'd have, two such huge powers coming face to face with each other. Um, and the reasons, as I alluded to earlier, for that are because Taiwan is a democracy, and until now, the United States has kind of, not overtly, but in many ways made it relatively clear that it won't allow democracy to be attacked. So that's an ideological reason, but also for the economic reasons. The fact that Taiwan produces really important semiconductors, and at the moment there's a reliance on those, but that might be changing. Uh, Things actually might be changing pretty radically now. Um, there are a number of red lines in this issue which could trigger conflict. And one of them is that the United States or Taiwan unilaterally declare the island's independence. The People's Republic of China has made clear, particularly since 2005 when it passed a law, an anti-succession law, saying that if anyone were to make the claim that Taiwan was independent, either as president of Taiwan or president of the United States in particular, um, then kind of it would be forced to take action. So that's the red line. That hasn't happened so far. We have to hope it doesn't happen, but that would be the red line that would not be something that China would allow to be crossed without taking action. Um, what that action might mean is not very clear. A military onslaught onto Taiwan, an amphibious landing, as I said earlier, would not be easy. It would be really, really a tough endeavor. But a blockade, that would be possible. And of course, cyber attacks, these sorts of things, that all would be possible. So China does have a number of options. Until now, the way that the United States has dealt with this is to sort of leave things ambiguous because it does not want to be played by the government of Taiwan, manipulated into, kind of having a fight with China. It definitely doesn't want that. So it's never really said explicitly that it would stand by Taiwan since 1979. It doesn't have a treaty with it saying it will defend it if it were attacked. But on the whole, the assumption would be that it would do something. The current geopolitics, however, has changed a great deal. And the thing that's most changed, well, two things have changed. Firstly, well, in fact, three things have changed. Three things that are really important. Firstly, the position of China under Xi Jinping is pretty nationalistic. There is many, many references since 2014 that Xi Jinping has made to the need to resolve this issue. It cannot be left to history. He said this a number of times. His politics is quite nationalistic. There's a desire to reunify the great nation. China has a powerful military now, has a massive kind of economy. So it has the capacity to do things today that it didn't have in the past. That's the first thing. The second thing is the position on Taiwan. Overwhelmingly now, Taiwanese people in surveys and elsewhere say that they are not Chinese. They're not Chinese Taiwanese, which they said in the past. They're Taiwanese. Their identity is Taiwanese. And their current government, elected last time in early 2024, is led by a man called Lau China. It's a party called the Democratic People's Progressive Party. They have a strong desire for more autonomy leading to independence. In many ways, they do believe that de facto their country is independent. And so they definitely don't want any talk of reunification. So that's changed. That's a stronger feeling than, for instance, even 20 years ago or 30 years ago. The third thing that's changing is the evolving position of the United States. Under President Biden, there were several statements he made saying that America would come to the assistance of Taiwan were attacked. That's not US policy. He said these comments in interviews and officials had to row back from them, but it showed that America in its new competitive relationship with China definitely felt that it was not going to just stand by if China did anything. Under President Trump, it's returned a little bit to the ambiguity of the past, but there's a sense that, in fact, for him, the main interest is doing something with China, having a better trade deal, that sort of thing, and that in some ways Taiwan is almost negotiable. This is not
Like
something
Ukraine.
that has ever, indeed, like Ukraine, yeah. So this is a new dimension. It's very, very unclear. His vice president, J.D. Vance, has been extremely isolationist, and it's not very clear if Taiwan is going to sort of shift some of its semiconductor manufacturing capacity to America. So I think Iowa, I think that's where it's going to be going, or is going. What is the sort of real link with, kind of Taiwan and America once that kind of big part of the relationship changes? Kind of there's a sense that China is more important to America now than Taiwan. Trump has complained about Taiwan manufacturing these semiconductors and taking manufacturing capacity from the United States. He said that Taiwan should be doing far more to spend money on its defense. It has improved that. Taiwan has spent something like 2.5% of its GDP on defense. But I mean, it's kind of got to increase it a bit more. So there's all sorts of pressures on Taiwan from America rather than just from China. And there's also this issue of into the future with this changing geopolitics and, the likelihood that America is going to be less and less willing and interested to get involved with external, kind of fights and issues, whether it really wants to spend money on defending people that are the other side of the world. I mean, all of this language is not likely to go away very easily. So it really puts Taiwan in quite a big predicament. It's democracy right next to China. It's traditionally been very, very reliant on American security umbrella, but that is growing a bit more questionable. What are the viable futures for a situation like this? Well, in the book, I kind of argue that at the moment, despite all these changing issues in China, Taiwan, and the United States, the situation is still so volatile and dangerous that it's really best for everyone to take a deep breath and just try and stick with what we have at the moment, which is the status quo. This is an extremely irritating argument, I know. I mean, there are people that would maybe want to solve this issue in Taiwan's favor. There are plenty of people in China who want to solve it in China's favor. But I don't think that anyone has a consensus at the moment. So my argument is that it just needs to be left as it has been for the last 50 years on the basis that at least the scrappy one China policy has worked. But going forward, I suppose there is this issue of what might kind of give for this issue to finally be resolved. Can it go on forever like this? That's not likely. In 20, 30 years' time, are we really going to be seeing the same situation we see today? Well, I think two things need to change fundamentally for this to be resolvable in a way that works for everyone. The first is views in China on sovereignty. It has stuck its itself, very vehemently against any idea of federalism, which might be a solution. It wants, full reunification, complete integration into China, despite the fact that its politics and Taiwan's politics are so different. So it doesn't work at the moment. It might be that in a few years' time or even decades' time, China's view on sovereignty will change and it will not be so hardline. That's possible. The second is maybe even more complex, and that's really on identity. Views on identity in Taiwan have changed, and as have they in some extent in China. But in Taiwan, as I said, most people don't see themselves as Chinese now, they see themselves as Taiwanese. So there's a possibility, though, that too might change in the future. Um, we're looking at a world where the economies and situation of the West are more and more kind of vulnerable. A lot of confidence is seeped away. I'm looking deep into the future now, 20 or 30 years. What does that world look like? It might be a world where Asia and China are really, really strong. There's been some political change. Suddenly, Taiwanese thinking that they want to be part of this rather than particularly in their alliances as they are at the moment with the West. It might be different. I know that that is extremely unlikely at present, and it can't work at present. But sovereignty and identity are definitely things that can change. And just on that matter, I guess that's where I kind of find a little bit of hope. In 1978, if you'd have said, what would China be doing in the future after, the death of Mao Zedong in 2 years earlier, I think most people would have been very, very skeptical that it would undertake the kind of economic reforms it did, which have led to the results we see today. But that's what it did do. It changed dramatically, and it embraced some elements of capitalism with Chinese characteristics. So, kind of it has been able to change, and that's very surprising. It's able to surprise. At the same time, in 1978, if you looked at Taiwan, you would have assumed that the leadership of the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, would also be continuing for good. It would look well entrenched. It was one party, still under martial law, no real likelihood of radical change. Of course, within 10 years, that situation had also changed completely. And today, as I said earlier, Taiwan is a vibrant democracy. So these are places that can really change in fundamental ways. Who knows what might happen in the future? Maybe some amazing solution will fall from the sky. But as of today, now, at this moment, no such solution exists. So that's why I argue in the book that we have to stick with what we've got. Thank you.
Well, it's those imponderables, but it's almost like a Ptolemaic epicycle. There's so many issues revolving around the whole issue of sovereignty, for example. If Taiwan, then why doesn't China claim Singapore? It's full of Chinese. It's got lots of money. It's in the vicinity, so let's go for it. Or come to think of it, why doesn't Britain reoccupy and reunite with Australia and New Zealand? Or come to think of it, Ireland, which was under British control for 800 years. There's all sorts of precedents, but of course the Chinese are sort of a little tunnel visioned or wall visioned about these things and don't quite see it the same way. The King Charles III is the King of Australia and New Zealand, and they seem to manage to get along with it quite well. I don't think there's any great desire for reunification on either side, and I can't see the tattered remnants of the Royal Navy going to reoccupy Sydney Harbour at any time in the future, let alone Dublin. But there are other implications here, which it goes beyond, is that a lot of the post-war sort of post-Cold War settlement has hinged on the fact that the US nuclear umbrella was implicitly covering countries like Germany and Japan and Korea and Taiwan that forbore developing nuclear weapons because they felt they could rely on the Americans to do it. if that sense of security goes, then how long is it before Japan and Korea and in fact Taiwan, if I were in the Taiwanese government, I'd be looking around if anyone's got a suitcase full of nukes to sell me, just in case, because it's obviously, as we saw in Ukraine, it's a deal breaker in some ways. So there are global implications quite apart from the fact there might be a big punch up between China and Taiwan, and the Americans might get involved. There's all sorts of other implications for the architecture of the globe in this. And when we look at China, of course, we have well, the Chinese Communist Party is not a communist party in the old sense. It's kept all of the totalitarian controls, but the social amenities that you expected, the iron rice bowl and the rest of it, were thrown out at one point. And it seems to me that Xi and the others, they can't argue politics anymore in the same scale of the Cultural Revolution because they have no ideology worth talking about. But they are substituting this with the nationalism. So, beating your chest about Taiwan is one way to prove that you're a hairier-chested Maoist than the others, which is, I think, what's been happening. I think is what's been happening for the last decade or so. So, I'd like your sort of thoughts on that and the implications for Chinese domestic politics of all of this. Is it a winner with the because all the polls show that most Chinese, just like most Americans, don't agree that Panama is the Canada is part of them. That's because the Canadians are standing next to them shouting. But most Chinese seem to think that yes, Taiwan is theirs and we should have it in a very sort of jingoistic way. How does that all factor with the personal domestic constituencies?
Well, I mean, I think Xi Jinping, you refer to ideology. I mean, I think Xi Jinping is a populist and nationalist, and so this is important because it's really about we lost this territory in our history, and getting it back again is important for our renaissance and rising in the world again and making us great again. I mean, the reason why the history of Taiwan is um, kind of important to understand is because it isn't very clear. To be honest, the history in the last 400 years has been, kind of mostly on the margins of China without really being formally part of it. It kind of came really in the ambit of the Chinese sort of dynastic control in about the 1680s, but it was sort of considered a kind of peripheral area that was loosely associated with the south of China, but not
Full of
really that
pirates and
important.
savages, yes.
Indeed, full of pirates and savages, and not a very easy place for people to go to. Very many rebellions, kind of really hard to govern. Wasn't a great posting for Chinese officials to be sent to. So, not very clear status. It was formally a kind of province right at the end of this period from about I think it was 1885, or even later, 1887, till about 1895, when, as a result of the Japanese beating the Chinese in a war, they gained control over Taiwan. I mean, they gained ownership of it. And so for half a century after then, Taiwan was owned by the Japanese. And that still leaves an influence today when you go around Taipei and cities in Taiwan. You kind of do feel, well, this has got things that look and feel a bit like Japan in terms of its architecture. The fact that many older people still speak Japanese as a foreign language rather than anything else. Food is very influenced by Japanese food. So, that is a real influence on the place.
And the
From
Taiwanese, I mean, apart from the ones who came with the KMT from the mainland, don't share the instant and spasmodic revulsion towards Japan that the mainland does. Many of them I spoke to have quite fond memories of Japanese occupation. They remember they remember the KMT coming as the bloodthirsty barbarians who were killing locals.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think that the irony is that at the end of the Second World War, the defeat of Japan, uh, Taiwan was probably one of the most developed places in the whole of China. Well, what was then called China, Republican China, because the Japanese hadn't really undertaken the sort of savage campaigns that they undertook on the mainland. So it was largely pretty well developed. I mean, the only 4 years in which you could say there was a unified thing called China, which Taiwan was part of, was between 1945 and 1949. Yep, I mean, then it was part
Did
of China,
you
it's the Republic
have
of
you
China.
read Red Star Over China by Edgar Allan Snow on Mao
Yeah, yeah,
Zedong in Yunnan? Because
yeah.
in there he says that Mao told him that the issue of Taiwan could be resolved by local self-determination after the war, after
Indeed.
Japan was defeated. It's one of the least quoted quotations from Chairman Mao on either side.
Well, I think he said a similar thing about Inner Mongolia, and as you said earlier, I mean, that's not remotely autonomous. So I think in 1935, he said all autonomous regions can have a decision on what really happens to them, and of course, it never happened. So it was once in power, Mao Zedong was not keen
He
on
was not a
any of these
Democrat
regions
or
breaking away.
self-determinist, no.
Not at all, no. So, when the Civil War happened, as you rightly say, between sort of 46 and 49, yeah, the nationalists, the KMT, they kind of sent, I think, 1.5 million or 2 million people to Taiwan, and their government went there. Chiang Kai-shek went there, fled there,
And
and
the National
so it was
Museum went
separate
there as
again.
well, of course.
Indeed, yes, it did, and I mean, it kind of created massive. I mean, the population of the island then was about 7 million. When you have an influx of about 1.5 million, that has a huge impact. Um, and so, that kind of meant there was always this division in society between the mainlanders who came in 49 and the people who were indigenous to the islands. I mean, either the native population who'd been there for centuries, um, or kind of Han Chinese who'd moved there also, for hundreds of years. So it was a really kind of split population. That division is not so important now, but it kind of shows that Taiwan is a very different place, and that's probably why today, people, it's been in this sort of existence now since 1949, 76 years. I mean, most people only know their island as having the government it has now, in the sort of situation it has now, their memories of being part of China for the 4 years. There's very few people that can remember that. So it doesn't really have any kind of big emotional pull to people on Taiwan. But in the mainland, it's extremely important because of this desire to have a great, powerful, unified, strong China again, even though, historically you can kind of be very skeptical about that.
Well, from the point of view of the rest of the world, nobody especially has a percentage in poking the dragon. But the question is, to what extent do you pander to the dragon? And the fine line, as we saw, the sort of almost theological division between acknowledging China's claim to one China and accepting the claim is it looks theological, it looks very abstruse, but we've seen what Vladimir Putin did with that in the case of much less ambiguous language over the former Soviet Union and Ukraine. So, to what
Mm.
extent can the rest of the world hold firm and say, look, you can say it as often as you like, and we recognize your aspirations, but we actually respect the right of the locals. I remember, in fact, it just came to me when Sir David Hannay, the British ambassador to the UN at the time of after the Gulf War, they were negotiating on the anti-terrorism treaty, and the difficulty was defining anti-terrorism. And he told me the Chinese ambassador kept trying to add secessionist activities to the list of it, and he said, "Why is everyone ignoring me?" And Sir David tells me in his very patrician tones, "Well, I told him that the rest of the world, we do not accept that wanting secession is necessarily a criminal activity, as long as it's not pursued in criminal ways." And it was a very neat put down, but I think it was probably lost on the Chinese ambassador.
Probably so. I mean, I don't think that they are flexible. I mean, they're not flexible about this issue. They regard it as one of national, you know, that Taiwan is part of China, and there's no debate about that. And so, you know, they kind of think this is a domestic issue. Um, and what do they think today? I think they see the divisions and the instability in the outside world, particularly in America and Europe, and they think we can still wait. I mean, I think their view is we can still wait because everything they see shows the decline of the West. I mean, rightly or wrongly, they might be wrong in that assessment, but as of today, you'd have to say
They have many grounds for
economically,
believing that, yes.
yeah. I mean, you wouldn't. I mean, if I was sitting in Beijing, I'd think, okay, yeah, we just wait because these people are going to continue to sort of make a mess of things. And as I said, the Trump attitude towards Taiwan is transactional. So, I mean, is this sustainable? Does it really want? I mean, is it likely that you know Trump will make a big commitment for Taiwan if there is an issue? I mean, who knows? But I mean, um, it's certainly something you can question in ways that I wouldn't have questioned in the past. I'd have said, yeah, America would definitely do something to kind of protect Taiwan if something happened. And today, I think it probably still would, but I'm less certain than I was 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Mhm.
So
Well,
those are the sorts of things that I think China really kind of pays attention to.
your approach is one that would have appealed, I feel sure, to Deng Xiaoping, who sort of had strong views on the color of cats, dead or alive, Schrodinger's or otherwise. Um, well, he didn't have strong views. That was the whole point of it. He had quite flexible views about them. Um,
Mm.
is there any why? Uh, is there any hope that Xi's mind will be taken off it by events in domestically? Because you know there are occasionally rumbles that it is not all united. I mean, he's tried to rein in some of his more avaricious comrades in the bureaucracy amongst the cadres to and and cement his control. But how long will he need Taiwan to maintain that control? Or you know, is he
Mm.
truly deeply ideologically a nationalist and wants to push the boundaries?
Well, he certainly speaks the language of a sort of firm nationalist. You know, obviously China at the moment has economic problems, so it's not. Um, I mean, those are its priority. Um, I don't think, you know, people say that they're planning an invasion in 2027. I have no idea what that really means, but I'm skeptical. I think they understand that even if tomorrow Taiwan were to say we want a reunification, it would be really, really a huge task, you know. So if it were an aggressive move by China, it would be colossal in its implications. You know, we would be living in a world which wouldn't be the world we live in now. It would be a world where China really was an enemy rather than a you know a competitor or you know a kind of strategic
Well,
you know
Putin seems to have
competitor.
got away with it. So it's the way the Chinese might look at it.
Yeah, but I mean that's small stakes, right? I mean I'm not saying that Russia Ukraine isn't important, but economically, geopolitically, you know, Russia is what 10% the size of the Chinese economy, and I think that Beijing is risk averse because it knows a lot's at stake. I mean, if it gets it right, it could end up as regionally and maybe even globally the strongest power. I mean, that is what's at stake. So would it kind of want to blow all this because of Taiwan at the moment when if it waits, it could just get what it wants without expending a huge amount of effort. I mean, you know the old Sun Tzu, the art of war, you know, only fight the battles you know that you don't really need to kind of do anything because you're going to win them. I mean, it's best not to fight, you know, and just
Well,
wait for the opportunity to
to
come to you.
pursue those examples again, obviously that when Putin sent the tanks rolling across the Ukrainian border, he thought it was going to be a walkover. He thought they were going to have a couple of sandwiches and a coffee in Kiev and then leave a puppet government in control. Uh, It was not thus. So you wonder if some self-deluded Chinese general or politician thinks, oh, it's a walkover. We'll just go and have a day on the beach in Taipei and then come back.
I don't think they do. I mean, I think that they saw what happened to the Russian military when they invaded Ukraine and realized, okay, this did not go well. And this is a land war which is relatively straightforward, still awful, but relatively straightforward. So I think that they understand how difficult it is, which is why I think blockade is a more likely thing in the future. Um, Also, cyber attacks, also continuing to isolate Taiwan, continuing to put pressure on, just basically waiting for the moment when enough Taiwanese might say, you know what, do we just sort of sit in this situation like, more and more precarious, or do we kind of try and do a deal? Personally, of course, I don't want that day to happen. I'd like the status quo to continue, or, well, I mean, really, for the two sides to kind of change in such a way that a wonderful mutual, a mutually agreeable course of action becomes possible. But I'm
Like
also
Britain and Australia, for example.
yes, like Britain, Australia. But I mean, I'm a realist, so I know that isn't remotely possible at the moment, and that's why we have to tread water. I mean, um, policymakers like to have nice, neat, kind of outcomes, but this isn't one where you can have an outcome. It's about just um, treading water and preserving what we have at the moment, which is peace, even if it's not easy peace, because the alternative is to have absolute bedlam, which would impact on everyone, not just in the region, but across the rest of the world.
Well, look, we're getting towards we're talking the subject out, and we haven't had any questions yet. So unless one of you guys out there wants to pose a question in the Q&A box, I think we should think about winding up and staying treading water, as Kerry says, and uh, and pray earnestly that the treading the water carries on. The water isn't filled with sunken battleships and landing craft,
Mm,
which
indeed.
is a distressing contingent. I noticed the Chinese, in fact, have just there were leaks yesterday of new landing craft like the Mulberry harbors used at Normandy. Uh,
Mhm.
so people have to prepare, have to show that they're preparing, I suppose, to keep their kudos in China.
Yeah,
This is
yeah.
Ian Williams. I've been talking to Kerry Brown, whose book, Why Taiwan Matters, is short, succinct, and objective and simpatico to Taiwan, which is a very nice place. I always admired the fact that they managed to get a fully fledged national health service, free of point of entry. 20 years ago, I went there just after, and it was a miracle. And I, I think they discreetly asked me not to mention it too much when the Republican politicians in the room, in case it upset their base in Washington. But thank you very much, Kerry. Do keep in
Thank you very
touch,
much.
and let us hope that your future observations and will come to us, and also that your lack of prognostication carries on, that this particular Schrodinger's box is not opened in the near future, um, which I think
Here's
is what the
hoping.
Taiwanese want as well. Thank you, Kerry. Thank you,
Indeed.
everybody else. We'll see you all soon, I hope. We have other things, if Samantha will put them up soon. We have coming up, we have Craig Unger and his book on the October surprise, which is relevant about Republican candidates conspiring with foreign entities to make sure they win the vote and to thwart foreign policy initiatives in order to shape electoral outcomes. Sounds familiar. It's something in the wind, I think. But that will be coming up soon at our meetup. So do please come. And there we go. April the 14th from 6 to 8 o'clock. Uh, do come, and you can talk to Craig, and you can also have, well, drinks and meet other members. Thanks very
Goodbye.
much. You're welcome if you're in
Bye.
town, Kerry.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody. Bye.